Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Zulekha. I do want to begin by thanking, the organizers of the, UCT Summer School most profoundly for according me this opportunity to have this conversation, with all the participants, on the subject of, decolonizing, the social sciences. I do not take for granted this opportunity, to be able to have this conversation or to lead this conversation. And lastly, I do have to thank all the participants who have sacrificed their, Saturday afternoon, in order to be with us in this conversation. I do hope that would make, your sacrifice worthwhile, and that, you would at the end, of this lecture, consider the sacrifice as having been worth every minute of it. That said, I do have to just do one housekeeping and then we begin, which is that, many people who are around the university are going to be affected by load shedding at 2. And so what we have tried to do is to organize the lecture such that it fits within the time we have between now and 2 p.m. And then we will postpone the question and answer session to post 2 p.m. so that if there are people who aren't able to, remain with us after 2, at least they would have gotten, the totality of the lecture. So do bear with me. I'm going to have to go on for an hour in order that, as I said, we would be able, to maximize the time when we all have electricity. And so I'm going to speak for the next, 60 minutes plus minus, and then thereafter I would have a short break of about 5-10 minutes, and then we will reconvene after that short break to have, a question and answer session. If you do, want to raise a question, there is a way of doing that. You simply click on a raised hand there, like I've just done, and then we'll be able to recognize you and allow you to pose your question. Lance is going to help us in that regard, or if you have other questions, you can send a message on the participants bar on the side, to Lance Seal August. He's going to be able to respond, to whatever questions you may have as we proceed. Okay. Thank you very much. The subject of our discussion this afternoon is decolonizing the social sciences. And I'm sure as many of you saw the title, just like myself, there was a sense of apprehension as to how may one in just one discussion or at one attempt talk about decolonizing a whole cognate field, of disciplines, because the social sciences is nothing but a cognate of several other disciplines. Social sciences, it means that at the same time, we are talking about politics, we're talking about sociology, we're talking about, history, we're talking about anthropology, we're talking about, the theater, arts, we're talking about the other liberal arts. Now, as I say so, it must be noticeable to you that I am very inclusive in my category of the social sciences. I do not draw the strict distinction that many other people try to draw between the humanities and social sciences. As we are going to see, the history of all of these disciplines I've called social sciences, whether you have previously thought of them as humanities and as social sciences, we're going to see that their history is one. They have one intellectual genealogy, and they are all possessed by the same assumptions and underlying principles. And their colonial character derives, from the same, so to say, original resource, as we're going to try and make it clear. So please bear in mind, My category of the social sciences is very inclusive. It does not exclude any humanities and social science discipline. We include all of those disciplines. Secondly, as we trace the decolonization, or as we try and make sense, of the decolonization of social sciences, there is something that, obviously must come to mind, which is that once you say social sciences, you think about the university. Now, I'm not going to have enough time to talk about the university, but I want us, for a moment to think about the social sciences as a set of disciplines or cognate disciplines that have organized or that have been organized under this umbrella of the social sciences for no other reason but the purposes of the functioning of the university. So there's nothing else that, brings them together. There's no reason why we think of them, together as the social sciences. It is simply because they are meant to enable the functioning of the university. You organize. In order to administer, you organize. So they've been organized in this way in order to administer knowledge production in the university. So I want us to I hope I'm back. For a moment, it seems like I was kicked out.
You're all back.
Okay, thank you. So, I want us to think about the university as nothing but, as I've said, a regulated and an administered universe of discourse production or knowledge production. And I must repeat that. The university is nothing but a regulated and administered universe of discourse production or knowledge production. Nothing else. It's just a place where there is a formalized system of truth. So once you function within the university, you have to abide by its own formalized system of truth. It then begins to delimit the boundaries of truth. But it does not exhaust the totality of knowledge, neither does it exhaust the totality of truth. There is a vast expanse of truth and knowledge that resides outside of the university. And so, once knowledge enters the university, what it means is that it has conformed to the regulated and administered universe of knowledge production. That's all that qualifies it to be knowledge. It's not because it is such super, truth, nothing of the sort. It is simply because once you accept as knowledge, thinking of knowledge as a person for a moment, once you accept, the rules of this regulated and administered universe, then you qualify to be admitted as knowledge. Once you defy this regulated and administered universe, once you defy the rules of this regulated and administered universe, then you fall outside the university as truth. Or, to be more specific, those forms of truth and knowledge that defy this regulated and administered universe, the principles of this regulated and administered universe are then excluded from the boundaries of knowledge or from the boundaries of truth. So all the things that are called social sciences, one, we can already say that what is common to them is that they have accepted to abide by the principles of this regulated and administered universe. Just as people who function in the universities, they also have accepted, either implicitly or explicitly, they've accepted the rules that govern this regulated and administered universe. And so, this leads me to my second point. It is that academics or intellectuals who have accepted to function within the university have also accepted the rules that govern this regulated and administered universe. Now here is a quandary that I want to raise right from the onset. How genuine are people who today speak about decolonization of knowledge and decolonization of the social sciences or the university generally? How genuine are they when they, on the other side, have accepted the rules that govern this regulated and administered universe called the university? They all want the institutional affirmation. They all play by the rules of the university that creates a hierarchy. They all play by the university rules or the regulations of this administered universe that creates all sorts of very colonial relations. Now, this is a quandary that I want us to keep in mind as we proceed, because, as Fanon tells us somewhere in his writings, there comes a time when silence becomes dishonesty. I think there is a lot of dishonesty that has crept into the academy, particularly the discourse on decolonization in our university and in universities generally in South Africa. And what is this dishonesty? It is the silence of people who practice within these institutions, who fail basically to acknowledge that actually their own participation in these institutions, if it conforms to the rules of this regulated and administered universe, their own participation is complicit to the perpetuation of colonialism. So it means then I want to suggest to you that decolonization of the social sciences and of the university cannot be a career. If it's a career, it has to be a very perilous career. It is a perilous career because it cannot lead to institutional affirmation. You cannot be celebrated by the same university that you tell us you are fighting against if you continue, of course, or rather put more succinctly, if you continue to await the affirmation of the university, which means that you abide by the principles of this regulated and administered universe, you cannot again come back to us and say that your thinking is also suffused with a decolonizing impulse. So decolonization cannot be a career. If it has to be a career, it has to be a very perilous career that often does not end well in terms of your relationship with the institution. You cannot hope that the same institution that you want to decolonize will affirm your exercise. And so there is some duplicity that I want us to note, which is in the silence. As Fanon says, there comes a time when silence becomes dishonesty. There's a silence amongst academics about how they themselves are implicated in the perpetuation of social sciences that are colonial. Now, having said that, a part of my motivation in giving this lecture is actually to dispel a few misconceptions that emanated, from the movement towards decolonizing the university that I was part of, that many of us were part of, in South Africa. And what is this misconception that emanated from there? It is again, this misconception, you find it reflected in those who think of decolonization as a career. It is that people have taken to the streets or have taken to, their academic writings talking about the decolonization of psychology, the decolonization of sociology, the decolonization of anthropology, or the decolonization of any other singular discipline. Now, how may we hope to decolonize anthropology, to decolonize, sociology, to decolonize these disciplines, as if you can decolonize these, various disciplines and leave the umbrella institution or umbrella framework under which they are organized as is? So you can have a decolonized anthropology within social sciences. that misses the problem. Can you have a decolonized political science, but you leave social sciences as it is? Can you have a decolonized psychology, but you haven't changed the social sciences? You've accepted the structure, you've accepted its underlying principles, you've accepted, its discourses of what social sciences is, but within that, you then hope to have a decolonized discipline. You cannot, and I want to demonstrate that in a moment, that it is a misconception that perhaps we've paid dearly for, as those who have struggled towards or for the decolonization, of knowledge and the university in South Africa. In order for me to be able to make that obvious, I have to begin by defining what is social sciences. Indeed, we have said that, social sciences is basically a cognate or a motley of several disciplines, that come together. But that's not enough. As we've said, they basically come together for the purposes of administering the university. So that is not enough to unify them. I suspect there is something more that unifies them, and we may be able to get to that by thinking of what is disciplinary knowledge, and in a sense, thinking about what is social scientific disciplinary knowledge. Now, one of the things that unites the social sciences is what is called a disciplinary self-consciousness. It's a disciplinary self-consciousness that includes periods of assessment or self-assessment. So social sciences, people who function within these disciplines have what is called a disciplinary self-consciousness. And this self-consciousness means that from time to time, they think of themselves together, assess themselves together as social scientists. And so this self-consciousness means that there are things that they hold dear amongst themselves or that they hold common amongst themselves. And what are these? It is that they all think of having common set of generalizations. Social scientific generalizations, they all have common set of theories and methods. So they employ the same methods and the same theories, and they have the same set of generalizations. And again, this body of individual disciplines possesses a common body of classical works. Now, anyone who's familiar with the social sciences will wonder whether Karl Marx was a political scientist or whether Karl Marx was a sociologist, whether Karl Marx was an economist. Karl Marx is considered to be father of all of these disciplines. Max Weber, to a certain extent, pervades all of these disciplines, and several other, classical works, pervade many of these disciplines. And so, in a sense, if you take just these three, the fact that people in the social sciences have a certain self-consciousness that includes moments or periods of self-assessment, the fact that they all share the same body of classical works, and the fact that they all subscribe to the same set of generalizations, social scientific generalization theories and methods. Indeed, people in the social sciences are quick. You hear them, when postgrad theses, are discussed, they say, well, in the social sciences, there are certain kinds of generalizations that are not possible, that are possible in the natural sciences. It means they have a certain sense of generalizations that are acceptable in the social sciences. Or they would say that, well, there are certain specific social scientific methods, and this thesis does not seem to, understand these methods. Academics are very, want, to discuss in those terms. But they help us in this instance understand that social sciences basically can be thought of as one discipline in the sense that they share all of these features. Now, if indeed it is true, as I want to suggest, that we can think of social sciences as, having these common denominators, there is something more that is much more important in bringing them together. It is that they all have the same intellectual genealogy. They all draw their generalizations, their assumptions, their founding assumptions from the same originary moment. And what is this originary moment? It is post-Enlightenment European bourgeois thought. Now, in order to be able to explicate this, I do want to draw you, or to draw your attention, to a piece of work that was written by Achimafeje as far back as 1976. Achimafeje wrote, an article in 1976 titled "The Problem of Anthropology in Historical Perspective: An Inquiry into the Growth of the Social Sciences." Note this, very important article. The Problem of Anthropology in Historical Perspective, an Inquiry into the Growth of the Social Sciences. Now, why do I draw your attention to this? It is because I want to show that you cannot talk about the decolonization of a singular discipline in the social sciences, because all of these disciplines draw their assumptions from the same source. And what is this source? It is what I've called post-Enlightenment bourgeois thought. Now, Achimafeje does basically, or provides us a lead in thinking about this moment, this originary moment of the South Africa, of the social sciences generally, in his work, which is an inquiry into the growth of the social sciences. But I do have an aside that I want to, to point out in mentioning Achimafeje. Now, Achimafeje wrote this in 1976. There is an unfortunate development at the University of Cape Town. It is that the University of Cape Town deliberately this was begun by white scholars, and black scholars have bought into it. It is that the University of Cape Town has basically reduced its remembrance of Achimafeje into a figure who's a victim of history. All we remember about, or we are made to remember about Achimafeje, is that UCT did not employ him, and a few white people, to satisfy their liberal consciousness, protested, knowing fully well that their protest was not going to lead anywhere, protested against, UCT's refusal to employ him. Achimafeje is an intellectual, a leading intellectual figure in the continent and the world over. All that we're told, or we're made to remember about him, is when UCT refuses to employ him. And suddenly no one says, but wait a moment, what else did he do in life? Those other things that he did intellectually are far more important than the fact that UCT did not employ. In fact, once we look into his other works, we see why UCT would not have employed him. It was not because of apartheid, it was his views towards knowledge production. And what were these views? In part, they are said in this piece of work that I've referred you to, which is an inquiry into the growth of social sciences. Now, what does Achimafeje do in this piece of work? One of the things that Achimafeje does in this piece of work is to criticize, fellow social scientists who were obsessed, and this is 1976, remember, who were obsessed with thinking about individual social scientific disciplines and thinking about decolonizing them as individual disciplines, just like we thought, post the 2015 movement, student movement in South Africa. So at this time in 1976, anthropology, which was at the time his discipline, was one discipline that was under siege from within and from without. Many scholars were pointing to its colonial origins, but they were also pointing to its close association with the colonial state. And so many people wrote against anthropology and the need to decolonize anthropology for that reason. What Achimafeje then does is to say that all of those who were obsessed with critiquing anthropology, they made a mistake, because, as he says, those who pointed, their critique towards anthropology and thought about the problem of anthropology to be its colonial character, or it's because, or who thought about anthropology and its complicity in the colonial domination of the black colonized, Achimafeje argued against them and said, well, they err in thinking that the problem could be attended simply by stripping anthropology of its colonial tendencies and then radicalizing it. Because at that time, there were all sorts of movements, which led to things like radical anthropology. And so the assumption is that once you stripped anthropology of its colonial, origins, you could radicalize it. Or once you strip sociology of its colonial origins, you could radicalize it and talk about radical sociology. Achimafeje says no. They err in thinking that the problem, I repeat, could be attended to by stripping anthropology of its colonial tendencies and radicalizing it. Rather, he suggests to us, and this is the lesson I want to bring, from Achimafeje to this moment. Rather, to surface the problem in its complexity, anthropology, Achimafeje teaches us, had first, alongside all other modern social science disciplines, to be returned to its origins within Enlightenment thought. In this way, Achimafeje says, it shall become obvious then that the problem is not anthropology, the problem is not sociology, the problem is not politics, but the problem is Enlightenment bequeathed modern bourgeois social sciences in their totality. And so, according to Achimafeje, and here I quote Achimafeje directly, he says, and he charges, or rather, he says, those who think that the problem is with these individual disciplines who miss the fact that the problem is not these disciplines, but their originary moment, which is the Enlightenment bequeathed bourgeois modern social scientific thought, because that's where they all emanate from. They've not always existed, to simplify. Maybe I need to simplify that. What here, Achimafeje and anyone who's interested in the history of modern social sciences is drawn to is the fact that sociology has not always existed as sociology. Anthropology has not always existed as anthropology. There was a moment when all of these disciplines existed under a different umbrella, a common umbrella, under Enlightenment bourgeois social scientific thought. And then they began to grow out, of this originary moment. So they have one parentage. This is why we must trace their intellectual genealogy. And this genealogy will take us to this root moment where each of these disciplines gains its assumptions, gains its generalizations, gains its theories, and its methods. And so the problem, to reiterate, is not politics, sociology, or anthropology. Because for those who do so, Achimafeje charges, and I quote, they create what he calls an epistemological contradiction by treating colonial anthropology in isolation from metropolitan bourgeois social sciences, which are equally functionalist and imperialist. Indeed, he continues, that makes the problem of anthropology seem colonial or ideological rather than universal and theoretical. As a specific anthropology, the Enlightenment represented both a system of thought and a mode of existence, the meaning of which is a problem of historical analysis. One thing certain is that the Enlightenment was bourgeois, and that it sought to make its own anthropological viewpoint universal. End of quote. Now, what Achimafeje says here is simply that the problem is not individual social scientific disciplines, but the problem is their originary moment, which is the Enlightenment. And so, in order to decolonize we have to return to this originary moment, which is the moment of the metropolitan bourgeois social scientists. And we can already see what it is that we will find when we return there. It is functionalism. There are other things that we are going to find. Now think of it. Anyone who has studied social sciences from anthropology to political science to sociology, you all have encountered functionalism. Now suddenly you must ask yourself whether it is structural functionalism in anthropology, whether it is institutional functionalism in political science, whether it is, functionalism as functionalism in sociology, all of these things mean the same thing. Now, what we are already beginning to see are the cardinal pillars of the social sciences. One of them is positivism. The other, rather, in addition, to functionalism, is positivism. Again, whether you are in anthropology, whether you are in sociology, whether you're in political science, or any other social scientific discipline, you surely have encountered the concept of positivism or positivistic social science. I must return you one last time to Achimafeje, in his charge against the attempt to disaggregate the social scientific disciplines and think that you can decolonize individually these disciplines and leave, their originary moment, which is metropolitan bourgeois social science as is, and hope that you would have decolonized. And so, after Achimafeje has elaborated for us what is a critical history of the emergence of both positivism and functionalism in and together with industrial capitalism. Now, this is the genius in Achimafeje. It is that he joins positivism and functionalism into the development of capitalism. Now, it's an interesting theoretical maneuver that, hopefully you can raise at, question and answer session, and I will delve it, on it at that point, which is simply this. Simplified, the point. Sorry, someone is unmuting himself or herself, and I'm hearing an echo that is rather disturbing. Could we all mute ourselves? Okay, so what Achimafeje does is to show that functionalism and positivism emerged together with, these are two things. It emerged together with and in capitalism, meaning that functionalism and positivism were things that developed within and together with, capitalism. So we cannot think of them outside of capitalism. They basically developed in service of capitalism, just as capitalism made possible, their development. So what Achimafeje suggests to us, after he elaborates a critical history of the emergence of both positivism and functionalism in and together with industrial capitalism, he then says, and I want to quote, "My purpose is to suggest that the intellectual effort, which is anthropology, was a service to colonialism, not because of crude suppositions about direct conspiracy or collusion, but mainly because of the ontology of its thought categories. What is germane to our argument is the fact that the parameters of the anthropological enterprise," and here you can read any other social science discipline. When he says the parameters of the anthropological enterprise, it could as well be the parameters of the political science enterprise, were as much colonially determined as they were informed by bourgeois theoretical suppositions in the form of functionalism. It must be apparent by now, Achimafeje continues, it must be apparent by now that the problem is not one of single disciplines, but rather of that last sentence is critical to what we are going to try and do here today. That last sentence from Achimafeje, which is simply that the parameter, or rather, which is simply that the parameters of the anthropological enterprise, and here read any social science discipline, were as much colonially determined, which simply means that what renders anthropology, political science, and sociology colonial is not just the fact that they were in service of colonialism. Rather, their coloniality was as much of the fact that they were colonially determined as they were informed by bourgeois theoretical suppositions in the form of functionalism. It must be apparent by now that the problem is not one of single disciplines, but rather of bourgeois society and its relativist methodology, which is positivism. Now, what Achimafeje basically does here for us is to tell us of the futility of trying to decolonize one individual discipline in the social sciences as if it were distinct from any other discipline. Two, Achimafeje points us to the futility of thinking that what makes the disciplines colonial is the fact that they had a close association or relationship with the colonial state. He says you can even divorce them, anthropology, from the colonial state. Its problems remain exactly as they were because the problems emanate, they predate anthropology's service to colonialism. The problems emanate from the originary moment, which is the moment of post-Enlightenment bourgeois social scientific thought, whose cardinal pillars are two things. Well, there are more than two. It is, for our purposes, positivism and functionalism. Again, I've made the point that it doesn't matter what discipline you study in the social sciences, those two things you encounter, they seem ubiquitous in the social sciences: functionalism, structural functionalism, institutional functionalism, and all of those things. Now, Achimafeje wrote this article in 1976. And I want you to note another study that is written or published that very same year when Achimafeje wrote, his article. It is a study written by a Nigerian political economist called Claude Ake. Claude Ake published that very same year a small but very important book titled Social Science as Imperialism. I highly recommend, because other than just functionalism and positivism, it deals with all the other methodological assumptions and generalizations that sit at the foundation of the social sciences. Now, there's something curious, which any student taught properly would know about the history of the social sciences. It is that these two pieces of work are published in the same year, 1976, by Achimafeje and Claude Ake. But there's something even more interesting, which is that they were both at the same institution when they published these works, and actually worked in the same department in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania. They were both at that time part of what is called the Dar es Salaam School of Radical Political Economy. You can see what communities of scholarship do, or the importance of communities of scholarship. They were people involved in discussing the same ideas because they were responding to the same societal questions. This is the period post-independence. They are concerned with the decolonization of knowledge and of the institutions they had inherited from colonialism. That is why they belong to the same generation. It is because they were seized with the same intellectual questions. I wonder if you can say the same about the scholars today who are seized with questions of decolonization in post-apartheid South Africa, whether they constitute communities of scholarship that are responding to societal questions. I can already answer the question for you. What you have here are careerists, people who are interested in turning what are genuine societal problems into ladders for career advancement. But that's not the concern. The concern is to show how the problem of decolonization cannot be carried out in individual, social scientific disciplines, because they all have the same methodological assumptions, and we have highlighted two of them, positivism and functionalism. Now, people might already begin, what is the problem? Or ask rather, what is the problem with functionalism and positivism? How is it that they must be thought as constituting, the colonial character of these disciplines? Now, if you think about post-Enlightenment European thought, there is something that it does, which is that post-Enlightenment European thought, we know, is post-Enlightenment European thought. It is thought that emanates from a particular geography and a particular cultural context. And that particular geography is a place called Europe, very small part of the world. That particular cultural context is the context of European modern, cultural context. So all the social scientific disciplines are emerging within the context of European modernity as a cultural context. Now, if you think about European modernity, when Europe becomes modern, what we mean by Europe becoming modern, it is when Europe becomes a modern capitalist society. And so virtually everything begins to obey the logic of capital. Now, if you for a moment expand your understanding of capital as not just money, but capital as a set of regime and relations, as a set of rules that govern, or rather as a set of rules that govern relations, then you would understand what we mean, because what capital does is that, just like property, the best way to explain this is, if you think of property, private property, it is not the building that you see that is called private property. It is rather the rules that govern your relations once you enter that building. So if it's called a private property, it doesn't describe just the building. It describes the set of relations and the set of, interactions that are then permissible within those premises. It tells you of the things that you can do and you cannot do whilst you are in there, because it's a private property. Capital is the same thing. Capital is not money. Capital is something that begins to regulate your relation to things and to fellow human beings. It transforms your relationship to things and to fellow human beings. So capital is a set of relations. It dictates how we are expected to be unto things in the world and unto other human beings in the world. The worth of the next human being becomes ascertainable on the basis of these rules of capital, just as things in the world become things that you can either afford or not afford. What capital does, it transforms everything in the world into a commodity. So everything must have a certain value. So it begins to transform the relationship you have to things. So when Europe becomes modern, so if the social sciences develop precisely at this moment of the transition into the modern period, modern capitalist period, and if the social sciences emerge precisely at this moment, it means that the social sciences also began to internalize the same rules that govern, or the same set of regimes that are inherent or integral to capitalism. And so knowledge itself begins to acquire the same value as things in the world. Remember, we said capital transforms things in the world into commodities that you can acquire. And so everything must have a value, you can attach a monetary value or a material value to it, because that's what capital does. It transforms things to commodities. So, if then the social sciences emerged precisely within this moment when Europe, is becoming modern capitalist, it means that just like capital, it is not immune from the same principles that govern other relations that capital comes to govern. To simplify, what happens is that social scientific knowledge, as it is today, whether it is anthropology or politics, begins to have just one value. It is something that, one, is possible to attach value to. So when you come to the university, you want to study anthropology, they have a price for it. If you come to the university to study the social sciences, generally they have a value for it, which is different from the value of the natural sciences or the value of medicine and all other disciplines. Because just like all other objects in the world, they have taken the status of a commodity. Now we know what commodities are. We know that commodities, are things of easy virtue, for a lack of, a better, framing. Commodities don't attach themselves necessarily where they need to be. Need is not what governs commodities. Commodities don't circulate where need is. Commodities circulate where money is. So what it means is that social sciences teaches us basically to think of knowledge as nothing but a commodity that has a material value. And what is this material value? It is how much is it going to fetch me when I finish? Now, it's not an inherent thing that when students come to the university, they think about how much am I going to be able to make when I've finished this degree. People are not born thinking in that way, but people become socialized into it, and they begin actually to perpetuate that kind of thinking which emanates from Enlightenment bourgeois foundations of social sciences, even though they claim to be decolonizing. The object of knowledge is no longer knowledge in itself. The object of knowledge is what is it going to enable me acquire when I have finished studying the social sciences. And so what social sciences are suffused with is a certain ethic where every station of work is basically your waiting period. As an academic at UCT, I'm expected to be servicing clients. I see how students write to me, as an academic at UCT, they write to me as if, it is their right as consumers of, the education that UCT sells to them, and I'm expected, just like a salesperson, to respond to every of their claims. So it is as though their education is for them, and I'm a service provider, just like the university sells itself as a service provider. And as an academic, I'm expected to respond in the same way and become implicit or complicit in the perpetuation of that system. What if the purpose of knowledge was to create an intelligent society? What if the purpose of education was to create communities of intelligent human beings? But also, your education is as much a responsibility of me and the other person, because your education has been made possible by society. So it can't be your right, like, the bread you go pay for at, Spar or any other shop. It is a responsibility of society, because education is meant to govern how you relate to yourself, to things, and to other human beings. But we've been long on that point. The point I want to raise to is that what capitalism, or what, the Enlightenment foundations of social sciences also do, is to create a framework of historical time that pretends to be universal when it is not universal. We have said that modern knowledge emanated from this particular geography, which is called Europe. but also the fragmentation of historical time into pre-modern, modern, and postmodern is also an abstraction from this particular geography. It's not universal. So what the modern social sciences do, all of them, is to then integrate the history of all societies, including non-Western societies, into this grid of historical time. So everything must exist as what existed in Africa in pre-modern times, what existed in Africa in modern times, and what exists in Africa in the postmodern times. It doesn't matter whether people are Marxist or liberal, they all have the same understanding. Marxists would say pre-capitalist, capitalist, and post-capitalist, which is the same thing as pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. Now, what this does is that it sets a universal framework of time into which all histories of all other societies have to be implanted. And when this framework of Western knowledge, of Western social sciences encounters other societies whose time is not that of the West, what it does is that it integrates what fits into these historical times and kicks out whatever else doesn't fit as being outside of knowledge. So the point is, you cannot then address the problem at the level of the discipline because all social sciences subscribe to this universal, unilinear notion of time, where the supposition is that all societies move through this unilinear pattern where there is a sequence of historical stages wherein each successive stage represents an improvement on the previous one. Now, for as long as we subscribe to this notion of time, it's going to be impossible to talk about non-Western forms of knowledge, for instance. Now, let me quickly try and demonstrate. It is that anyone who has some little knowledge about African forms of healing will know that this notion of progress, this notion that time proceeds in a unilinear function. You move from your worst condition to a better condition. So your condition at each successive stage represents an improvement on the previous one. This idea of time is what is used, for instance, in modern Western medicine. When you go to a doctor and you see a doctor and the doctor gives you a review date, what he or she has done, he has planted or she has planted you into precisely this, unilinear time where you came to see the doctor at the worst condition, medical condition, and he or she expects that when you come back for your review date, you would have moved to a better condition, and from there again to a better condition until you healed. Now, anyone who has some little familiarity with African modes of healing will know that it is impossible to think about healing in African cosmic world in that way, because you don't move from your worst condition to an improved condition to an improved condition until you healed. You move in different, in a different pattern of time, which may be a reversal, which may be a movement forward that will be followed by a reversal and all sorts of movement. It doesn't have, a set pattern of healing, because healing in African cosmology is in part a restoration of an equilibrium between yourself and your ancestral world. And now that restoration is not a mechanical process, because you are restoring an equilibrium between yourself and living beings on that other side, meaning that these living beings have agency. And so you cannot predetermine, your healing process like a medical doctor is able to put you in this empty homogeneous time marked by stages. So if you study in social sciences, implicitly you've accepted this notion of time that is, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Or if you study sociology, sociology says these were simple society that are in the process of becoming complex societies. And simple societies are characterized by, institutional diffusion. When they become complex societies, there is institutional disaggregation where one institution performs one function. Remember functionalism that we spoke of? So the problem here is that the social sciences subscribe to this universal time. And when this universal time encounters other societies where their history is not organized into these, historical periods, what does it do? It forces the histories of these societies into this historical time. And in the process, these societies become nothing but minor versions of this universal time. They become corrupted versions, basically, of the unfolding of the spirit of capital. So when people explain underdevelopment in Africa, it is Africa's failure to develop properly, because there is a model of development that they ought to follow. That is the universal model of moving from being simple societies to being complex societies. All of these assumptions are common to all of, the social sciences. They are not peculiar, to any one discipline. Now, what I do want to do briefly in, the next few minutes is try and suggest that what we have is a problem that exists at two levels. At one level, you have this universal history of the social sciences that takes us back into the post-Enlightenment period. And so we have to then confront these post-Enlightenment bourgeois foundations of modern social sciences. The second level of the problem is what exists at a specific level or at a specific moment in South Africa. So, one of the things that has crippled our understanding of the decolonization of social sciences in South Africa and at the University of Cape Town is this supposition that the problem only exists at the universal level. So once we have spoken about the racism of knowledge, then you have attended to the problem in South Africa also. No, the South African problem has its own specificity. So when we decolonize the social sciences, we're going to have to engage this at different levels. We're going to have to engage at the level of universal social sciences, quote and unquote, which is what we've just done. But we're going to have to look at the specificity of the problem in South Africa. The reason why we have to look at the specificity of the problem in South Africa is because South African social scientific thought also developed along the way, in addition to these assumptions that we have tried to sketch out, also developed its own specific assumptions, its own specific predilections, and its own specific prejudices. So we can think of what we have to do as decolonizing social sciences. Once we have done that, we have to also decolonize South African social sciences. Now, why do we have to speak about South African social sciences? Is there something called South African social sciences? Is there something peculiarly South African about social sciences in South Africa that distinguishes it from social sciences everywhere else in the world? I want to suggest to you that indeed there is something specific about social sciences in South Africa. And we have to first understand what is this problem of social sciences in South Africa in order to be able to properly decolonize. So in the next few minutes, I want to sketch for you the character of South African social sciences and the colonial character of social sciences specifically in South Africa. Now, in order to do so, I want to take you through what I want to call key historical moments in the development of South African social scientific thought. Remember, we said social sciences as disciplines, as a collective of disciplines, are characterized by a certain level of self-consciousness. Now, as I trace the history, the intellectual history of South African social sciences for you, I want to show you those specific moments when this collective self-consciousness develops among South African social sciences, such that they come to think of the enterprise they are involved in as having a distinct character as South African social sciences. Indeed, to chase to the answer, at a moment when South African social sciences had sufficiently developed this self-consciousness, it termed itself, or it called itself, South African Studies. Now, South African Studies is basically the name for South African social sciences that had developed a peculiarly South African self-consciousness. They had become self-conscious of the enterprise they were involved in. Now, part of what defines this consciousness is that it was a wide self-consciousness. It was a consciousness that developed amongst white academics. And in the development of the boundaries of this self-consciousness, they made it a point that they excluded Black South Africans. And so if you think about South African social scientific thought as an ideological discursive field, it excludes Black knowledges. Right from the moment of its foundation, it excluded Black South Africans. Could someone confirm whether I'm still audible? I think we've just been taken off the grid, but I think I have enough battery and internet to continue. Am I still audible?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, to reiterate the point, now we've spoken briefly about Western social sciences. Now, I want to domesticate this discussion by focusing on South African social scientific thought. The question is, what makes it peculiarly South African social scientific thought? One of the things that makes it peculiarly South African is the self-consciousness that emerged amongst white academics who were constitutive of this body of thought called South African social scientific thought. And in this self-consciousness, they excluded Black South Africans. Now, as I take you through the different historical moments in the evolution of South African social scientific thought, you will see how Black South Africans constantly are being excluded as participants. But there is another kind of inclusion that happens in the process. It is that throughout, please note, throughout, Black South Africans are included as objects of study. Throughout this history, through these various historical moments, and I date them as being 7 historical moments. Throughout these historical moments, Black South Africans are excluded as participants or as subjects of knowledge, but included as objects of knowledge. They are beings to be studied, and at every moment, they must be available to be studied. Let's chase to these different historical moments. Now, the first historical moment is 1652 to 1750. Note that my periodization is my own schema. It's heuristic. It's not a nice, it's not a tight, periodization where, each period indeed begins and ends at that moment. There are overlaps, but it's very useful. It's useful in the sense that we are able to say between 1652 and 1750, which is almost a century, what was going on in South African social sciences, or indeed, can we say that South African social sciences had emerged at this point? This originary moment, there is very little thinking about what was going on as South African social scientific thought. The kind of knowledge that is dominant at this time is what is known as the Fan Rebic Diary or the Fan Rebic Journal. Now, for those of you, again, who have a social scientific understanding of knowledge, not compartmentalized disciplinary knowledge, this thing called the Fan Rebic Journal, you know, there is something in Cape Town called the Fan Rebic Society. It is that society that has preserved not just this journal, but several other writings that were produced in this period. Now, mainly the writings that were produced in this period were writings by Fan Rebic himself, but also writings by company officials. Company officials who were attached to the Dutch East India Company. Now, this knowledge, you know, produced at this period, somewhat, as I've said, is not very integral to the history of South African social scientific thought. It will come back later on. You would see it will come back later on when it is brought back into the mainstream by Afrikaner intellectuals in the 1940s and 1950s. But from 1652 to 1750, really no one cared about the Fan Rebic, you know, diary or the Fan Rebic Journal and all of these writings by, you know, company officials. There was little conversation going on, you know, about this within this community. In fact, there was no sense of a community that was in conversation, that was conscious of its existence as a community. So this period basically, you know, in a sense, you could say it's a period, you know, in the history of social sciences, but really its contributions at that moment were really minimal. The period subsequent to 1750 is the period 1750 to 1850, almost another century. At this moment, there is a distinct body of knowledge. There is a group of people who are in conversation with each other, who are conscious of their enterprise as a community. Now, what I'm going to do as we trace these different moments, I'm going to exemplify each moment with the key texts that were produced at that moment and the debates that were going on. So there are the texts that were written from 1750 to 1850 were basically travelogues. There were these, you know, travelers, you know, who traveled, you know, throughout South Africa or Southern Africa and wrote travelogues. And the two key, you know, writings of this moment were travelogues by one by an English scholar called John Barrow. John Barrow, if you could see, you know, wrote, you know, his travelogues. They were titled An Account of Travels into the Interior of Southern Africa in the years 1797 and 1798. John Barrow is the doyen of this period. The other figure in this period is a German traveler called Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein or Lichtenstein, Heinrich Lichtenstein. He wrote a book titled Travels in Southern Africa in the years 1803, 1804, 1805, and 1806. Now, I took these two for a reason. One is that you would see that if you read Lichtenstein, who's German, he was very conscious of what John Barrow had written. And in fact, you can think of these, or once you've read these two texts, you can see that there is a debate going on between the two. John Barrow is English. He's very condescending towards the Afrikaners that he finds in South Africa as he travels throughout South Africa. Lichtenstein is German. He's very sympathetic to the Afrikaners or the Dutch. And he writes in contradistinction to many of the claims that John Barrow makes about the Afrikaners as being backward, barbaric, as having been or as having escaped, you know, the Enlightenment. Lichtenstein, you know, has very sympathetic sensibilities towards Afrikaners, and he writes in defense of the Afrikaners against John Barrow. Already, what these two do is to set up the foundation for a debate that will ensue in South African social sciences post-apartheid, or rather, at the time of apartheid, where the English considered apartheid to be the source, or rather to consider the Afrikaners as the source of apartheid because they were backward and barbaric. Now, there was nothing novel about what the English were saying about the Afrikaners post-1948. So you read a lot of English writings, that try to render the English innocent from apartheid and saying, well, apartheid was an Afrikaner thing because the Afrikaners were barbaric and backward. It's an old debate that began in this moment from 1750 to 1850, and particularly it's a debate that is readable in the works of John Barrow and Lichtenstein. Now, what other concerns do we find at this moment in the history of the South African social sciences? It is that there is an obsession with the physical appearance of the native. In all of the writings in this period, in the travelogues, they take great pain and pages upon pages to describe the physical appearance of the natives. So the mental image or the mental picture, for instance, most people have of the Khoi and the San basically comes from these descriptions. Without noticing, people actually think this is how the Khoi and the San appeared. They think they have a correct mental image, and they never bother to say, but wait a moment, where did this mental image come from? This was a colonial mental image, just as it is that these writers or these travelers were concerned with describing the physical appearances of people as if ethnic identity determined people's physical appearance. And so there are all chapters, the physical appearance of the Zulu, the physical appearance of the Xhosa, the physical appearance of the Khoi and the San. What you begin to have is that in the framing of consciousness, in South African social scientific thought, we begin to associate ethnic identity with physical appearance. But it was not just physical appearance. This obsession with describing the visual appearance of the natives, because they never described, by the way, themselves as the English or the German travelers. No. They are subjects who shine their light to objects, to us as the natives. So now this obsession, with the physical appearance of the native is actually a profiting. What they do is that these travelers profit from what had happened within Enlightenment thought, which is that Europe began to think of non-Western people or African people as people by whom or of whom you associated their body with their behavior, or more specifically, their behavior was readable from their bodies. So you did not need to understand their behavior. Once you understand it's a black person, then you can figure out their behavior from there. So at this time in the South African social sciences, there is a bourgeoising tendency to think that the behavior of black people is readable from their bodies. So they become nothing else but people whose objecthood tells you everything about them. Fanon calls it thingification. And so at this period in time, there is a supposition that the body is indicative of our behavior and ethical dispositions. Now, it's a tendency that continues until today. I don't need to tell you of it. But because of time, I have to draw your attention to an important study of this period by a South African sociologist based in Boston College in the US called Zine Makubane. Zine Makubane writes an article, very key, titled "The Body of the Savage." humanitarian narratives from 1800 up until 1827. In this article, The Body of the Savage, what Zine Magubane tries to do is to show how the body of the savage or the native is indicative of his or her behavior. And I do want to read to you the close association of the body of the savage with his or her ethical disposition or behavior. Now, the Evangelical magazine, published, in 1817, it's a British magazine, of the London Missionary Society. It had this to say about the close association of the body and behavior, the body of the native and his or her ethical behavior. It says, and I quote, "Ordinarily, the dispositions of men's minds appear by natural signs of them in their countenances. So do both good and evil dispositions, cunning, levity, and wantonness, a proud and haughty spirit, a fiery and passionate temper, and other mental evils are discovered in the looks of men and render them unpleasant. The contrary virtues or virtues also have their signs in the countenance, making it very agreeable." All you have to remember here is that mental evils are discoverable in the looks of men. That is the key, concern in this second historical moment. We will raise, there's a lot to say about it, but we will race to the third because of time. The third moment is 1850 to the 1900s. Now, this third moment is dominated by colonial missionary writers. Remember, at this time, Europe has already sent to us missionaries to come and civilize us. Now, to civilize, remember, was also to transform the body, because the body is a sign of evil, or is the source of evil. Once you transform the body, then you have attended to the evil dispositions. So once you've said people should stop wearing traditional earrings, you are attending to their evil dispositions that are readable from the body. So the project of civilizing them is the project of attending to this body that is the source of evil. Now, I do not have to tell you of how that today continues to be part of, thinking in South African social scientific thought, but also in medicine. People who study medical anthropology will tell you of how diseases have tended to be closely associated with biology. So there is a tendency to assume that certain diseases are basically a function of people's biology. It comes from this moment when the body, the somatic, is also indicative of, and this is what, is dominant in South African social scientific thinking. The third moment is the moment between 1850 and 1900, dominated by colonial missionary writers. And the most prominent of the writers at this moment is a missionary writer, British missionary writer called John Philip, the Reverend John Philip. Now, Reverend John Philip wrote this, this book titled Researches in South Africa, illustrating the civil, moral, and religious condition of the native tribes. It's published for the first time in 1828. Now, this third moment in, in the history of South African social scientific thought, there is something that distinguishes this moment. Now, what is readable or a cursory reading of literature produced at this moment is that of the numerous works produced around this time, from the beginning of the 1800s to be precise, reveals a generalized concern with a set of common questions, themes, and objects of study. There is, for example, a noticeable concern with the kafir as an object of observation. From these texts, the native emerges as a candidate naturally marked for Christian pity and missionary empathy. Black people emerge as people towards whom missionary empathy and Christian pity has to be shown. Now, again, time does not permit, but I want to tell you of how, this Christian pity and missionary empathy later on in the 1900s expresses itself as liberal sympathy towards the blacks. The consciousness of modern liberals, even today, that say that you must show empathy and pity to black people, and so you must, integrate them in the economy, and you must treat them differently because they are victims of historical, injustice, is all an expression of this. It's a continuation of this Christian pity and missionary empathy. Because what it doesn't do, it doesn't say what is the source of their condition. Now, colonial missionaries couldn't ask that question because the answer would have been the source of their problem is us. It's the same thing with liberals. Today, as you are going to see when we get to that moment when liberal scholarship flourishes or liberal social sciences flourish in South Africa, the liberals could not ask the question, if you say we must have pity and empathy towards black South Africans, what is the source of their condition? And the answer would have had to be, it's us. But they skip that question and jump into marking black people, as people who are deserving of pity and empathy. The second moment, or rather the fourth moment in the history of South African social scientific thought is the early 1900s. Now, the early 1900s, again, the exemplary works of this period are two. It is volumes of work published by an English scholar called Thiel. Now, for those who study history, they would know the name of that historian called Thiel. He published, Thiel, who I'm now confusing with Corey. Thiel published 11 volumes of a book titled The History of South Africa Since 1795. Note this, the history of South Africa since 1795. Why would Thiel choose to write the history of South Africa since 1795? The answer is simple, he's English. 1795 is the year when the English take over South Africa as a colony. And so for him, the period prior to that really is not the period of history, when the Dutch, controlled, or when the Afrikaners controlled South Africa. So what animates South African social scientific thought is this antagonism between English scholars and Afrikaner scholars. But we've said enough about it. The second figure who's very prominent at this time is a scholar called Corey. Corey published 5 volumes of a book titled The Rise of South Africa, a history of the origin of South African colonization and of its development towards the East from the earliest times to 1857. Now, again, the question might be, what was so significant about Thiel and Corey? Now, Thiel and Corey were very important, figures. If you read their biographies, I would encourage you to find their biographies. One of the things you would find is that they had both come from the UK. They had both been trained in the UK at a time when functionalism and positivism were at their best. So they were the best representatives of Enlightenment thought. But beyond that, both Thiel and Corey were not just marginal, intellectual figures in the development of South African, Academy or South African Social Sciences. Thiel had been a member of scientific communities like the Royal Academy of Sciences in Amsterdam and the Royal Historical Society in London. Corey, on the other hand, had been a founding professor or one of the founding professors at Rhodes University, or the university currently known as Rhodes. He had graduated from King's College in Cambridge, and both of them, there was a certain consciousness, that drove both of them. It is that they thought of their work as necessarily laying the foundations of a more positivistic social science or social scientific and historical study in South Africa. So typical of the age, they thought of themselves as turning what was previously a very, diverse and, amorphous field into a field that was much more scientifically organized and a field that, subscribed to methods of validation that were positivist, but also that could fit, into the disciplinary grounds that they were accustomed to back in the UK. It is no accident, actually, that Corey had been, a professor of chemistry, but he had this obsession, for the standardization of knowledge beyond just the natural sciences. In fact, he thought that the natural sciences could teach the social sciences how to be scientific and how to be organized. Now, there's another reason why I do mention Thiel and Corey. It is that both of them did not just organize South African social scientific thought, but they also were amongst the founding keepers of the archives in South Africa. So Thiel was first the keeper of the archives in the Cape. When he retired, Corey inherited that position from him. But what was important is that they both engaged in what was a very questionable practice, which was going around the communities, African communities or native communities, conducting interviews in those communities, and then documenting their conversations with prominent figures in these communities, and then archiving that as, knowledge. So many of the things we find in the archives today and say these are original accounts of the chiefs about the lives of their communities and histories of their communities were basically done by these figures. Now, there are many of them other than just Thiel and Corey. In what was then Natal, there was a figure called, Killy Campbell. There was, Corey. There were several other figures, throughout. And you know how you find these figures? It is that if you go to the archives in all the universities in South Africa, the archives in the universities are named after them. So Rhodes has what is called the Corey Library, which is an archival, repository. At Fort Hare, you find what is called the Howard Pym Library. Again, it's a white, liberal. At UKZN, there is what is called the Killy Campbell Library. And in all other universities, these figures, basically their names adorn the archives in these, universities. They were mainly the founders of the archives. Now, what is important, what I do want to emphasize is the fact that it means then that our entry into the archives as the Black colonized was basically at the behest of these colonial missionaries. But these were not just disinterested people. These were people who were sworn to the colonial principle of European superiority and black inferiority. So what it means is that the most enduring legacy of this moment is that we entered the archives at the behest of these figures. And so even the way in which the archives are organized, not just the architecture, but also what enters these archives is basically what these figures considered to be important. And as I've said, it is very evident that these were not uninterested figures. They were not driven by benevolence or keen on preserving knowledge for posterity, but they were as invested in the project of colonial domination as they were convinced of the suppositions of white superiority and black savagery. So the lasting implication of this moment for South African social sciences is that such implications were threefold. One, as can be gleaned from the discussion we've engaged in, it is that the constitution of the South African archives that the field of South African social sciences depend on was basically the task of the colonialists. As a result, the entry of the black colonized into the archives was mediated by colonial interest and colonial values. And the categories settled upon in the archives on how to categorize the knowledge that came in, these categories were basically decided upon by these same settler colonial figures. So it was they who determined how we, the black colonized, entered the archives. They determined how we would enter and appear in history, because in them was invested the authority of selecting the material to be included, authenticating it through commentary, or withholding assent to it. And more importantly, of deciding how far back in time to go in archiving the historical reality of the black colonized. Now, this is very important. What is important here is that they could authenticate by commenting on what they found. So the things that we consider to be more truthful are the things that they also concur to. They say, well, this is a much more plausible explanation because they found other things, to affirm it. But anything they disagreed with, they basically withheld assent to or entered a comment that this is very doubtful. Now, ask people who read the archives whether this is not how they find themselves trapped by the colonial archives as they write social scientific thought. Last two moments is the moment from 1910 up until the 1940s. Now, this moment is basically dominated by two figures again. These figures are W. Macmillan, W.M. Macmillan, who's a historian, and his student De Kievit. Now, W.M. Macmillan was also an English scholar. So you see at this moment the continuation of what Barrow had started, of writing about the Afrikaners as if they were backward people, and blaming them for, everything else that white people had done, as if it was just the English. The importance of this moment is that basically South African social sciences at this moment became institutionalized. It became institutionalized. Remember, we said this is 1910 up until 1940s. Now, you would remember that whilst the process of establishing universities in South Africa predates the 1900s, it was only in 1916 that 3 university acts were passed or promulgated. These 3 university acts were the University of Cape Town Act, number 14 of 1916, The second act was the University of South Africa Act number 12 of 1916 and the University of Stellenbosch Act number 13 of 1916. What these three acts is that in just 1 year, the country legislated into existence 3 fully fledged universities, which needed a large dosage, of injection, a large injection dosage of academic staff members, because they did not exist in South Africa. But also it meant the migration of knowledge from all the fields where it had existed into the universities. So this is the beginning of that process we began this talk with, which is the process of the regulation and the administering of knowledge production into disciplines. So this is the moment when this process begins. So you have in 1916, 3 universities being established, the country legislating into existence 3 universities at a go, but also these universities importing large-scale academics from the UK, because of course at this time South Africa is basically dominated by the English. And so you have a lot of academics coming into South Africa from British universities. So it is not accidental today that you go, for instance, at the University of Cape Town to the Department of Philosophy, you find that all the people in that department are UK trained, particularly from Oxford or Cambridge. It's a continuation of a colonial linkage that supposes that academics have to come from, these parts, but, that the West has to continue to supply us, with thinkers. Or if you read the history of medicine at the University of Cape Town, there's a book, on the history of University of Cape Town by Howard Phillip that is very useful. Until today, you have departments in the medical school at the University of Cape Town that basically seem to be appendages of universities in the UK, where the graduates of these universities automatically, it seems like automatically they are shipped into these departments at the University of Cape Town. And so today you sit back, you look at how is it that you find departments that are dominated by people from one country, particularly the UK. It is a continuation of this moment. But here is the most important thing, because it's not just, the personnel. It is that most of these academics came into South Africa having trained in the UK at a time when post-Enlightenment thought was at its zenith. And so they brought with them intellectual cultures. They brought with them prevalent ideological orientations. They brought with them the dominant methodological tools that were preferred back in the UK. And most importantly, because they founded these disciplines, they also gave to them intellectual foundations of these disciplines, which were nothing but the same foundations upon which these departments had been founded back in the UK. So, the point is that from this moment, there was a movement not just of South African social sciences into the universities, but also the founding personnel in these institutions came from a particular orientation where positivism and functionalism, were the dominant, foundations. The last moment, key moment, is 1960 to 1994. And what are the important studies that mark this period? It is the book edited by Monica Wilson, an anthropologist, and a historian, Leonard Thompson. Now, why did I choose this book? It's because, it's a very oddly titled book. And often how colonially minded or conscious we are, we don't see, because we don't question these titles. The book is titled The Oxford History of South Africa. Now, Oxford is a university in the UK, just in case you wonder, which is this Oxford history? So basically what you have is that, Oxford has donated to us a history of South Africa. This is a history of South Africa written from the perspective of Oxford University. If this doesn't register, think of it this way: the University of Cape Town History of Zimbabwe. That's precisely what it is. Or the University of Cape Town History of Namibia. But because we are so colonially conscious, we do not see that there is something problematic in this text. So this is one important text of the period, the Oxford History of South Africa, edited by Monica Wilson and Leonard Thompson. It has 2 volumes. But the other key moment or key feature of this moment is the debate that ensued between liberal modernists and Marxist scholars who called themselves the revisionist scholars. Now, what was the debate? First, the debate was amongst white scholars who considered themselves liberal and who considered themselves Marxist. They were all white. This is what united them. The second thing that united them is that they were both. This debate was triggered. They all had the same source. Liberal modernism or liberal scholarship, social science in South Africa, and Marxist social science, particularly by revisionist scholars, emerging in the 1960s, was a response basically to Black consciousness. Black consciousness had emerged and said, well, the problem here is basically one of race. The problem is that you have Black people who are oppressed and they are oppressed by white people, and there is no other way of thinking about it. Now, the liberals, who were mostly in the same student movement as the proponents of, as the same proponent with the proponents of Black consciousness, that movement was called NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students. These liberal scholars distanced themselves from the proponents of Black consciousness and began to accuse them of racism. Marxists responded in the same way. They distanced themselves from Black consciousness and said it was a false consciousness. The problem was not race, the problem was racial capitalism. The problem was capitalism that is organized along racial lines. On the other hand, liberals were mostly English, by the way. Liberals fell back onto what had been the mantra amongst English scholars all through, which was that the problem is the Afrikaners. So the English liberals said, well, the problem is the apartheid state. It is a state that is introducing all sorts of distortionary measures, including identities. And so if the state ceased to introduce these distortionary measures, capitalism would self-correct all the other injustices that prevailed in society. And so this debate would dominate this period from 1960 up until 1994. I'm very conscious of time, and I'm going to end by saying that 1994 to date is the last of these historical moments. And I'm tempted to say very little and actually nothing about this moment, and leave it to people who live in this moment, who are in the university and at this moment, to be the ones to tell us in the question and answer session what is the distinguishing mark of South African social scientific thought post-1994. I thank you very much. Lance.
Okay. Lance, are you there?
I am here, yes.
Okay, I'm on my phone, so I can't see the head.
I cannot hear you, Zuleika.